What if the story you've always heard about how Christianity shaped America isn't the full picture? Long before megachurches, before influence, before a nation was even formed, there were small groups of people crossing an ocean with something far more powerful than ambition. They weren't chasing wealth. They weren't building empires. They were carrying a message, one they believed would define everything. But here's what makes this story different. America wasn't built first and then shaped by faith. In many ways, faith arrived first, fragile, tested, and uncertain, entering a land that was wild, unpredictable, and completely unknown. And that changes everything about how this story begins. Subscribe, because what you're about to see is not just history, it's the foundation of a nation. Imagine leaving everything behind: your home, your culture, your safety. Not for comfort, but for conviction. These early believers stepped into the unknown, carrying only what they truly believed mattered. And in that moment, the gospel wasn't just something they preached. It was something they had to live, or lose everything. But survival wasn't guaranteed. The land was harsh, the conditions unforgiving, and the future uncertain. And yet, even in the middle of fear and struggle, something began to take root. Not a system, not an institution, but a living faith that would grow stronger under pressure. And then, something happened. A shift that would take this quiet beginning and turn it into something unstoppable. A movement that would not only shape a nation, but send its influence across the entire world. But to understand that, you need to see where it all started. What drives someone to leave everything behind? Not for opportunity, but for belief. In Europe, many early Protestant believers were facing increasing pressure, limitations, and a growing sense that their faith could not be fully lived the way they believed it should be. And so, a decision was made, not out of comfort, but out of conviction. The journey across the ocean was not a simple migration. It was a risk that could cost everything. Long, uncertain voyages, unpredictable conditions, and no guarantee of what waited on the other side. But even in the middle of that uncertainty, they carried something they believed was worth more than safety: the gospel. These were not powerful people. They didn't arrive with influence or control. They came as families, as communities, as individuals holding on to faith as their foundation. And that foundation would soon be tested in ways they could never have imagined. When they finally reached the new land, it didn't look like promise. It looked like survival. There were no cities waiting, no systems prepared, no structure to receive them. Just land, wilderness, and the need to start from nothing. And in that moment, faith stopped being abstract. It became necessary. There are accounts of early settlers gathering together, reading scripture not out of routine, but out of dependence. Prayer wasn't tradition, it was survival. Every decision, every step forward was shaped by a belief that God was guiding them, even when nothing around them felt certain. But crossing the ocean was only the beginning, because bringing faith into a new land is one thing. Building a life around it is something entirely different. And what they would face next would test not just their survival, but the depth of what they truly believed. Subscribe. This trail is just beginning. What happens when belief is no longer just something you say, but something you must rely on every single day? In the early days of America, the wilderness didn't offer comfort. It demanded resilience. Harsh winters, limited resources, and constant uncertainty turned everyday life into a challenge that tested both body and spirit. This wasn't the kind of environment where faith could remain superficial. It had to be real. The early settlers didn't just talk about the gospel. They lived it in the middle of struggle, loss, and constant pressure. And in doing so, faith became deeply personal, not just communal. Families organized their lives around Scripture. Communities were built with shared values rooted in belief. There was a strong sense that survival wasn't just physical, but spiritual. That without faith, everything else would collapse. And that created a culture where the gospel was not separate from life. It was life itself. But this kind of conviction didn't come without tension. There were moments of doubt, fear, and questioning, times when the reality of their situation seemed overwhelming. And yet those moments didn't destroy their faith. They refined it, making it stronger, deeper, and more grounded. There are powerful accounts of individuals who, even in the hardest conditions, held on to their belief with unwavering determination. Not because it was easy, but because it was all they had. And in those moments, the gospel wasn't just a message from the past. It was a source of present strength. But something was building beneath the surface. Something that would take this quiet, resilient faith and turn it into a movement that would spread across the entire nation. And when it finally happened, it would change everything. What happens when a faith that was once personal and quiet suddenly becomes impossible to ignore? As the colonies began to grow, something subtle started to change. The gospel was still present, still part of daily life, but for many, it had begun to lose its intensity. It was there, but not alive in the same way it once had been. And then, without warning, everything shifted. Voices began to rise, not from institutions, but from individuals who spoke with urgency, conviction, and clarity. Preachers who didn't just teach, they challenged. They called people out of routine and into something real. And suddenly, faith was no longer passive. It became confrontational, personal, and deeply transformative. This moment would become known as the Great Awakening, a series of revivals that spread across the land, not controlled by systems, but carried by movement. Large gatherings formed. People traveled miles to hear messages that spoke directly to their hearts. And for the first time in a long time, the gospel wasn't just being heard, it was being felt. One of the most striking aspects of this movement was its accessibility. It didn't belong to a specific class, location, or group. It reached ordinary people, farmers, workers, families, individuals who were searching for something more than routine religion. And when they encountered this message, many described it as a moment of awakening, a realization that faith was meant to be lived, not inherited. There are accounts of entire communities being transformed. People who once saw faith as obligation began to experience it as conviction. Relationships changed, priorities shifted, and a new sense of purpose began to emerge. The gospel was no longer distant. It was immediate, personal, and powerful in a way that could not be ignored. But this wasn't without resistance. Not everyone welcomed this change. Some saw it as too emotional, too disruptive, too dangerous to established structures. Tension grew between tradition and transformation, between control and freedom. And yet, despite the opposition, the movement continued to spread. And here's what makes this moment so important. The Great Awakening didn't just impact individuals, it reshaped the identity of a nation. It created a culture where personal faith, responsibility, and conviction became central. And from this point forward, the gospel in America would never be the same again. What happens when a message that transformed a nation refuses to stay within its borders? After the Great Awakenings, something powerful had been established. The gospel was no longer just present in America, it was active, alive, and moving with purpose. And naturally, that movement didn't stay contained. A new wave began to rise. Not of settlers this time, but of messengers. Individuals who felt called to take what they had experienced and carry it beyond their own land. Missions began to form, not as organized expansions of power, but as extensions of conviction. The same faith that crossed the ocean into America was now preparing to cross oceans again. This marked the beginning of a global shift. American believers became some of the most active in sending the gospel to other parts of the world. From remote regions to growing cities, the message began to spread through missionaries, teachers, and communities willing to step into the unknown once again, just like those who came before them. But what made this movement different was its foundation. It wasn't driven by control or domination. It was driven by the belief that the gospel was meant for everyone, regardless of language, culture, or geography. And because of that, it adapted, it moved, and it reached people in ways that were both personal and transformative. At the same time, the influence of this faith continued shaping America internally. Education, community structure, and even national identity were impacted by the values rooted in Scripture. The idea that individuals could have direct access to truth, that faith was personal, and that purpose extended beyond oneself became deeply embedded in the culture. But again, this wasn't a perfect process. There were challenges, missteps, and moments where the message was misunderstood or misapplied. Yet even through those complexities, the core truth continued to move forward, carried not by perfection, but by persistence. And when you step back and look at the bigger picture, something becomes clear. What started as a small group of believers crossing an ocean became a force that would influence the world, not because of power, but because of a message that continued to move, adapt, and transform lives wherever it went. What began as a small group of believers crossing an ocean in search of freedom became something far greater than anyone could have imagined. From the uncertainty of the journey, to the struggle of survival in a harsh land, to the fire of the Great Awakenings, every moment in this story carried a purpose that went beyond the present. It wasn't just about building a life. It was about establishing something that would endure. The gospel didn't arrive in America as power. It arrived as dependence, as conviction, as something fragile that had to be protected, lived, and proven real in the middle of difficulty. And maybe that's why it took root so deeply, because it wasn't inherited easily. It was tested, challenged, and chosen again and again. As time moved forward, that same message didn't stay contained. It expanded, it crossed borders, and it reached places far beyond what those early believers could have ever seen. What started in small gatherings became movements. What began in uncertainty became influence. And through it all, one thing remained constant: the power of a message that speaks directly to the human heart. But here's the question that still remains today. What does this story actually mean for us now? Because this isn't just history. It's a reminder that truth doesn't need perfect conditions to grow. It moves through people, through moments, through decisions that may seem small at the time, but carry lasting impact. And just like in the beginning, the response still matters. Some heard the message and ignored it. Others resisted it. But some chose to live it. And those were the ones who changed everything. Not because they were powerful, but because they were willing. And that same opportunity still exists today. There are still stories unfolding, still nations, still lives, still moments where the gospel moves in ways that are quiet, but unstoppable. And if this story shows us anything, it's that what begins small can shape the future in ways no one expects. Subscribe, because the next journey is already waiting.